and I'll slow down a little bit. We'll introduce ourselves. Rhonda, I think most everybody knows me, but just in case, I'm Rhonda Orman, and I work in the HR department as a trainer.
I'm Sherry Williams, and I think I know everybody. I am the director of the library here on the downtown campus and teach the FYE class.
Sherry attended some training back in March with the AHA process, which has put out materials on under-resourced students, and we are on heavily on materials as we seek to better understand them and how we can reach them effectively. So we have spent much of the last year almost really trying to drill down into that material and understand it. Part of that is the use of mental models with under-resourced students. We know that under-resourced students are not always well-versed in formal register. And just as a quick reminder, the difference between formal register and casual register: formal register is the language of professionals. It is complete sentences, standard syntax, subject-verb agreement, starts at the beginning, chronological order to the end, and telling stories. Casual register, on the other hand, is the language of friends, about a 400 to 800 word vocabulary, does not use complete sentences, relies heavily on nonverbal cues, and the storytelling looks more like a plate of spaghetti. It starts with the most emotional point or intensity of the story, and then kind of travels back and then goes forward, and it's kind of like skipping through a movie. So that's the difference between the two. One is not better than the other. We all use them. It's just a matter of knowing what is the appropriate register in the appropriate setting. Okay, so many of our under-resourced students are coming to Jefferson and they are not well versed in formal register. This makes it difficult to understand some of the abstract concepts that are being conveyed in formal register. So it's kind of like a double jeopardy for them in that sense. What we're going to talk about today is how we can bridge that gap using mental models to help them better understand those concepts as they're gaining skills in formal register. So first we're going to talk about some definitions of mental models so that we are all on the same page here for what our purposes are. Then we're going to go through some examples of some mental models, and then we want to practice with you guys coming up with some mental models for some problem areas that you've witnessed or experienced yourself, okay, with areas that you've struggled. Let's start with definitions. The AHA process defines mental models as a process or a tool that helps explain big picture ideas, kind of the 20,000-foot view, if you will. It's a way to explain the big purpose of something, the big picture, the big idea. It's a way to explain complex processes, maybe financial aid or getting into school or things like that. It can be to convey specific content. Mental models are a tool that is crucial for developing higher order thinking skills, to understand abstract concepts. Keep in mind, abstract concepts do not have sensory representation. They're very skilled in casual register, and that is using sensory. They're used to relying on sensory information to get it. They don't have that when they're dealing with abstract concepts, so that piece is missing for them. Mental models are a method for helping the mind and differentiate between what is important and not important. They are held in the mind, as you can see with this slide, as a visual. It can be a pictorial image. They can also be, mental models can also be represented by stories, movement, or analogies. And if you think about this, the floor plan is the abstract idea. It is not the house. It's not concrete. It represents the concrete thing, which is the house. You could easily flip these in this image, and you could have the person looking at the floor plan and have in their mind a picture of the house. So you could think of those as both ways. The AHA process further defines mental models as a way to collapse the time that it takes to teach or learn information. So it shortens the time frame, particularly for abstract concepts, complex processes. It helps students understand there are multiple possibilities. Think of this. You could have dozens and dozens of different kinds of houses. Okay? And finally, AHA notes that mental models fill in the gaps for how and why. We spend a lot of time talking about what students are going to be learning. We don't spend quite as much time talking about how they're going to learn it or why they're going to learn it. We do some, but not as much. Mental models can help fill in those gaps. It goes beyond mere recall. They're not just memorizing the material for the test and then forgetting it a week later. Mental models help them really and retain it because it helps them understand the reasons that you do. Okay, following a blueprint accurately, if it's prepared correctly, will get you a very stable house. Okay, not following it or an incorrect blueprint is going to get you a house that's probably going to have foundation problems later on. So it helps them understand the reasons for the results achieved, and it helps them understand the processing skills. How do you go about doing this? Okay, that's the AHA process. Now I know that I'm faculty in this room, and I am going to make a confession, I am not faculty. So I'm part of that percentage of the population that likes Wikipedia. So I did also go to Wikipedia to see what they had to say about mental models. And I want to read you their definition.
I did tell Rhonda that librarians use Wikipedia for certain things. We just don't cite them on our academic papers.
Exactly. They're great to learn.
Okay, so Wikipedia defines mental models as an internal symbol or representation of an external reality, hypothesized to play a major role in cognition, reasoning, and decision-making. That sounds very similar to what the AHA process is saying. To me it does. It sounds very similar. But this is where it gets interesting. Wikipedia goes on to say slide. A mental model can be something that shapes behavior, solving problems, kind of like your own personal algorithm. Okay, so keep that in mind. We want to mental models as a representation of an abstract thing that has representation for it's up here, it's cognitive. Wikipedia have an effect on a student's attitude. So the more I sat and thought about that, I thought, you know, if I went to some of our students that are struggling with math, say, if I asked them to come up with a picture, just walked up to them, interviewed them, and said, I need you to give me a picture of an image in your head that represents your understanding of math. Is it possible that our students might give us images like a plate of spaghetti, or a ball of yarn that's just tangled up, or a string of Christmas lights that are impossibly intertwined and it's just best to throw it out and not put Christmas lights up? Christmas without lights, if that's your case. Is it possible that they might do that? Maybe. That seems attitudinal to me. Okay. Well, if we ask them, they might be going around with these mental models, but they might have an analogy, a story, a movement, something for them that represents what it is. So I want you to keep that in mind. The thing about that for me is, when I first started working on this, I thought, oh, well, mental models are just filling a void where the student hasn't thought about the abstract. They don't understand what it means filling a void. That the student does have a mental model, an incorrect mental model, one that has not served them well, and that we're replacing a mental model. And I was reminded when I thought that, I read several years ago a study, I think it was Harvard that did it, and they talked about how difficult it is to unlearn something and learn it a different way. Think, how many of you are right-handed? Okay, the majority of the room, if not everybody. What if I told you from now on you have to write left-handed? You know how to write. I know you all know how to write cursive because they were still teaching it then. Think if you had to write left-handed now, and how hard it would be to learn how to do that. Okay, Harvard says, and I don't remember the exact example they use, but I'll use this. If I'm learning A, the letter A can sound like a, a. But I don't, and I'm learning it that way. I might need to hear it 20 times, say, before it starts to kind of stick. I have to keep learning it, but it starts to stick maybe. But if I've learned that A, the letter A, sounds like K or S, and I have to relearn it, I'm going to have to hear it about 100 times. So think about that as you think about maybe replacing a student's mental model with one that has not served them well. Okay? So the AHA process uses 3 steps to create a mental model. How do you do that? You create a clear, succinct explanation of the 20,000-foot view, the big picture, the purpose of it. So let's social studies. The purpose of social studies is to examine human interaction throughout history. You can use that mental model, you can use a story, an analogy, a movement, a picture. But that's what you want to convey. Now we can talk about how individuals interact with other individuals, how they interact with maybe groups of individuals, how they interact with their government, structures of government, how those governments interact with other governments in other countries. You know, we can start talking about all that. But at the end of the semester, is the student going to remember the big picture? It's about human interaction throughout history. But if we use mental models at the beginning to frame it, they might have a clearer understanding as we go through the deeper levels if we first solidify this framework. So if we use a mental model. Social studies is about how humans interact throughout history, how we've interacted with one another throughout history, how we interact in our individual families, whatever those look like, how we interact with our community and our communities within a community, and how we interact with our government. When student, you can use that mental model to help them get the framework, and then as you drill down, it can help them begin to understand those next level understandings. Let's go through the Pythagorean theorem. I can say that word after all these years. Fine. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. I do not like that word. So many of you have seen this mental model. Help students understand it. Well, let's go back to those models that people can have. Now this may sound ridiculous, but I struggle with this. When I see Pythagorean theorem, my mental model of Pythagorean, it has both a visual and it has movement. I think of a very large snake squeezing the life out of its victim. And so let's go back to how you have to learn something new. If you are learning 7 times 9, you learned it's 65. When in fact it is not. It's 63. So instead of, you have to repeat. 9 times 7 is 63. 9 times 7 is 63. If you do that enough times, you'll learn it. But if you do 9 times 7, not 65. You're saying the same thing. You're just leaving out the real answer, but you're saying it's not that. Productive. That's the negative. So for me to say math is not a big snake trying to choke the life out of its victim is counterproductive for me. Does that make sense? I have to instead begin to understand really what that means. And I can be helped to understand that with things like this. Okay? Let's talk about miles. Definition. And I'm going to test you on it. A mile is a unit of distance on land, sometimes called a statute mile. It is 5,280 feet or 1,760 yards, compared to a nautical mile, which is sometimes called a geographical mile, and that is 6,076 feet or 2,025 yards. So you can see that the nautical mile is longer. Okay? Now, I know that a mile is from here to there. I drive my car, I know that it's point A to point B. So I can probably remember that. And I know that nautical relates to the water, relates to the sea. So I can probably remember that that relates to the sea and therefore transfer to the air. But what if the instructor puts geographical mile? And I'm going to think, oh, geography, that represents land to me. Think about sea and air when I hear that. So I might struggle a little bit. I got to put some effort into this to really remember it. But what if we used a mental model to help the students? If you had to draw a straight line through your head, say put a pencil through your head, going in the ear and coming out the other, that's a statute mile. But that if you had to draw a navigational mile, it won't go through your head. Think of my face as the world, the earth. It has to go around. Think of a ship going around. It's a mental model. So when I see you next week or the week after or in January, new semester, and I ask you which is longer, will you remember? Are you more likely to remember than if I hadn't shown you this mental model? You're all very well. So it can really help solidify and internalize the information. I'm a big fan of the Paul Elder thinking framework. Big fan. And I could talk for days and days and days about the need to develop critical thinking skills, why we need to apply the standards of clarity, relevance, depth, breadth, decision, to the elements of thinking, the 8 elements of thinking: questions at issue, point of view, purpose, implications and consequences, information. And if we do that on a regular basis, we are going to develop these intellectual traits. We will develop intellectual autonomy instead of intellectual conformity. We will develop intellectual integrity instead of intellectual hypocrisy. And I could talk on and on and on and on about this. And students that aren't snoring will probably be feigning some interest. But a mental model might help the students understand why it is in their best interest to learn how to apply their very best thinking to every decision they make in their lives. Who are they going to marry? What car are they going to buy? Where are they going to send their kids to school? Will they accept that job in California that they've been offered? Should they retire next year? You know, if I'm talking to staff. Or should they wait another year, another 5 years? We make small decisions and large decisions every day. And who wouldn't want to apply their very best thinking to those decisions? But how do we do it? I'm not saying this isn't good, and I'm not saying that we don't need to talk about it. We certainly do. And this is just one framework. There are dozens of them out there on critical thinking. With a mental model. This represents thinking above ground. This represents just our normal way of thinking. I think as a middle-class, middle-aged, Caucasian, married woman that has 2 dogs and cats. That's my frame of reference. For me to get out of that and be able to talk to my children, I have to think beyond the realm of that thinking that is so comfortable to me. Because I don't know what it feels like to be a teenage boy. I will never know that. So I have to be able to move down here. I have to apply the standards to the elements to think here. It affects everything we do. So a mental model can help draw people in, and not only to help them understand the concept, but to help them be interested in it, in why it's important. Why do we need to learn that? You can learn it by applying these standards to these elements. Okay.
Sorry, jump in. One of the things that struck me about this is the iceberg. So what if you only do the surface, then you may become. And I think students then they get that. What was it that the Titanic folks missed? Well, missed it. That was the problem. What is it? Attention to was all that. And there was obviously a great consequence for the Titanic in doing that. And so then I think, oh, okay, they get that.
So that's just another example. So steps 2 and 3 is basically a repeat of step 1. Let's use language arts as our example. You would find a mental model that describes the discipline of language arts compared to other disciplines. What sets that apart? What is the purpose of language arts? The purpose is to develop comprehension and capacity for use of written and oral language. You need to learn how to speak, to write, to read, to understand what that is. That's the purpose of all this. So that would be the broad thing, the broad mental model. Step 2, you drill down. A pattern within language arts is genres. Here I have used a mental model of these books: legends, folk tales, fairy tales. You could use bookcases. But if you set the framework up like this, then as you drill down those, the students they're not so confused. Okay? It helps them understand that, or it is one way to help them understand that. And then step 3 is just developing it for each individual skill as you go forth. When we were in Charlotte for our training, the AHA process talked about the 11 resources that this is certainly not the totality of them, but these are the 11 that they focus on with under-resourced students. And we could go through and we could talk about all these, and when we leave, and next week when I ask you, I start talking about one of them, and you're trying to remember, you may remember a few, you can't remember them all. A mental model to help remember all of those, they use the hand. It's your physical resource. Students are often, not always, but often strong. It requires a lot of stamina. They're working, they have children, they go to school, it requires a lot of stamina. Your pointer represents your spiritual, it points the way for you. Your emotional, you might understand, represents your how well you use the resource. How well you manage that resource. Your ring finger represents your cognitive. Beyonce says put a ring on it. It says think about it before you put a ring on it. Your represents the lowest resource that students have. The wrist represents flexibility of knowledge. Classes you can move back and forth more easily. More than one language, you can travel abroad much easier, depending on what country you're to. It can be a much better experience for you. The 3 resources, or the middle of your palm, is your support system and relationships. Think of holding someone's hand. And then the 3 that they don't include in the hand is language, motivation, and persistence, and integrity and trust. They lump motivation and persistence together and integrity and trust together. Now, I came up with this on my own, and I use this as language now because it kind of represents talking, formal or casual language. So you can see how it can help them to understand even just your weakest digit and your strongest digit. And you can kind of start to understand how you can carry that forth, and it's not just something you heard about in this session, and next week you're trying to remember, well, I remember financial was one, and I remember emotional, but I'm not really sure of the others. Okay, so it's a way to help folks retain information and go forth. So Sherry's going to walk us through some concrete examples, and then we're going to practice.
Do we want to switch?
Yes, we do. We're recording this. For the website.
Any questions so far, or thoughts, comments? I have a question. Are the mental models without visuals? Like a visual model, or without visuals? Just thinking about the different ways to process information, and visualize these words is all.
And keep in mind, I have used visuals. We're using PowerPoint, and I have used visuals. That's a good point. We probably should incorporate other things in this. It can be movement, it can be story, it can be analogy.
We're going to talk about football in a little bit, and not the football. So, I am a much more concrete person, and I must admit, when we tackled this at the training, this was really hard for me because trying to create a mental model, I was trying to, I guess it was more like the house where, okay, you have a house and then you have a floor plan, and I wanted it to somehow be a visual of that very thing. And once we worked with it more and I got the analogy, okay, so it doesn't have to be an actual visual of whatever it is, it just has to be something that you can relate to represent it. And so at Jefferson, 105, capacity you work at Jefferson, in whatever capacity, we often have an opportunity to talk to students about, well, why are you here? Why should you pursue higher education? And we talk about, better pay and the idea of having a career versus a job, being able to take care of the people you love, being well-rounded, just growing as an individual, be a contributing member of society. And we might talk some then about how do you actually become successful at Jefferson. What do you need to do? You need to do your assignments. You need to show up for class. You need to pass a class in order to move through your program. You're going to then advance to upper level classes or maybe finish with an Associate of Applied Science and go into a career. And by now the students, they're lost, particularly if you're talking to them in some of those initial interviews. And it may be the situation where at that point they think, oh, this is overload and I don't think I can deal with all this. So what if you talk to them about moving through college as if they were getting their driver's license? Now, not all of our students drive, but they all have a sense of what it takes to get a driver's license. So if you think about, all right, you're brand new at Jefferson and it's kind of like getting your driver's permit. So it's the very beginning and you're not really venturing out there on your own. You are, there are certain things that you have to do. And think of it perhaps, I'm a developmental advisor, so maybe the driver's permit actually is developmental coursework. These are things that you do before you're ready to move on to the next step. Or it could be, what do you need to do in order to earn restricted license to while you're in class, the things to do are show up for class, do your homework, engage in the discussions, prepare. You will actually pass that class. So you're moving on the driver's permit up to the restricted license. So you can kind of make it fit in, in allied health programs. Maybe these are the things you do your gen ed stuff and you apply for the program. And then once you're admitted into the program, you're in the restricted license phase and you're taking the classes that you need to actually earn your credential or meet your goal. And at the full license stage, that is where you have a lot more freedom and a lot more options available to you. So at that point, you've finished your degree and you're ready to work in your field, or you're ready to transfer to a university, or maybe your goal is you came here because you needed a computer class for a job that you already have. So you're not seeking a credential, it's whatever your goal is. I think sometimes for students, particularly with developmental coursework, for those of us who are developmental advisors, well, I don't want to take that. But you need to take it, you engage in the conversation. Perhaps the idea of, the driver's permit, that's the first stage, and you've got more guidance, more support. You have somebody with you so that you are learning the skills that you need to move ahead. And maybe, although they still may not like it, they might get it better. Because suddenly, okay, all of these courses, all of this stuff, it didn't make any sense to me, but I can relate to the idea of a driver's license. Also with the driver's license, if you have violations, if you choose to speed or do other things, that there are consequences you might get. So violations, if you choose not to participate in class, you choose not to do your assignments, then you perhaps fail a test, fail a class. Even in terms of financial aid, if you don't maintain a certain grade point average or make progress, then the consequences become more severe. You may lose your license or lose your driving privileges, meaning that suddenly you're on probation or you lose your financial aid. Because again, the concrete example of, okay, if you have a driver's license and you do things that aren't right, they understand that bad things can happen. And then the idea of higher insurance premiums, you know, if I think Professor X is just a jerk, and I'm not going to that class anymore, you know, I tuned out on all that stuff about having to withdraw, so I'm just not going. Life is good. I don't have to deal with that professor. However, down the road, there are going to be consequences. So it's sort of like higher insurance premiums. You know, if you have an accident today, your insurance won't necessarily go up tomorrow, but on your next renewal, bad things may happen. There's probably going to be a rate increase or something. And so it's sort of like that. If there are actions that you take today where you may not see the negative impact today, but insurance premiums, there will be consequences and those will show up later. And so it's just a way to perhaps make things a little bit more concrete for them. Talk about entering college, another example. Somebody who says, love this, when, the last day when we had arena registration, you know, and they came in that day and they said, I decided I want to go to college, and it's, you know, Friday, the last day of late registration at 11 a.m. So they haven't even filled out their application, and thank the Lord we're in a new world now, but we could talk to them about it, you know, okay, you have to apply online, and there's no cost for that, and then of course, you know, you want to complete the FAFSA, and with financial aid, you need to make sure you do these things. Check email regularly. Oh, and don't forget about your to-do list and PeopleSoft, and you might want to check into work study. And of course, you need to know about grants versus loans. And MTF is the time factor. Maximum time factor. So they don't use up all their financial aid before they've actually completed their courses. And then the satisfactory academic process, you know, and then a progress, and then appeals. I can't even speak at all. So the students by now are thinking, I can't do this. You know, this is way too much. Then you have SOAR, and that's much better than what we used to have. And then, you know, once you get into school, you're going to learn about a syllabus and Blackboard, and oh, and don't forget about withdrawing. Even if you don't like Professor X, you need to do something. And so we know that this is really overwhelming. So one way to maybe think about this is think of entering college as getting on the highway. You're going to get on 65 out here or 71 or wherever. So your admissions process is the honor. That's what you have to do to start. And then as you're making progress in starting in entering college, you have to fill out a FAFSA. So when you do your FAFSA and you start to tackle financial aid stuff, you're beginning to merge into that first lane. And with the FAFSA, once you learn about financial aid, you may have loans and grants. So there's different kinds of financial aid you can get. And we'll come back to that. You've done those first hurdles. You've gone down the ramp. You've been into the line of traffic. And you get into the so the next thing is I've got to do SOAR. I've got to do orientation, advising, registration. Merge over one lane. You're making progress towards your goal. Then finally, once you've done all of that, you can move over into cruising lane. You've completed your process, and you are now registered in classes. So you're in the cruising lane, jetting ahead on your towards your goal of being in college. In terms of loans versus grants, loans, there's stuff that comes later. So it's like a semi. We've got a trailer. I mean, there's more to it because you're going to have to pay back those loans eventually. So it's a little bit different than a grant where it's like can kind of zip along and you don't have to really worry about the trailer behind you that you're going to have to deal with. Another thing, as you're merging on, you're generally looking, seeing the traffic that's coming this way, and so dealing with financial aid and FAFSA, you need to be alert. You need to be paying attention to, I filled my application, but now I need to be watching my email and watch my due list and student service so that I'm aware of what is happening in my environment. I think in this scenario, students, even if they don't drive, they've been on the highway most likely, and so they have some, this is doable. Because certainly if I were driving for the first time, I cannot imagine what it would have been like, I go and I get my permit, and then, okay, let's go to the interstate at rush hour now, have at it. And probably what I would have done is said, okay, really, this driving thing, I don't think I'm really interested, because maneuvering through all of the semis at rush hour would just be too, and so I think understand what you're going to do. You're going to go up the ramp, and you get it from here. Then suddenly it breaks it down into steps that they can relate to, and it's not quite so intimidating. One of the things we know with under-resourced students is they have issues dealing with planning. And so a lot of times as an under-resourced student, you can't really deal with what's happening because you're dealing perhaps with, so it is about, we've talked before about the tyranny of the moment. Whatever's happening in that initial instant is what's driving you. You're not conscious of what's ahead. You're just reacting to whatever particular crisis might be. You're rushing around, trying to scramble to deal with whatever is happening. It's sort of like the morning. When this obviously it's a mental model, not necessarily that you would use with your students, but often in the morning, I get up. I may or may not really want to interact with anybody in my family until I've had my coffee. And so I'm kind of in the tyranny of the moment. Don't talk to me about planning. Don't tell me. I just want my coffee. Once I have my coffee, then my vision can. Yeah. So at that point, I'm very reactive. One of the things that we hope our students will do, however, is develop the skills to plan, both in terms of long-term goals like career goals, but more immediate goals, planning for assignments, planning for tests, keeping track of things. And I think our students don't realize that they do some of this. I know we talk about using a planner, and I always have some students use a planner or a calendar. They might even buy it, but they never write anything on it. It's like they don't get it. And so again, it's more living in the present as opposed to developing the ability to plan. And so we can tell them that you need to be proactive. These are the kind of things you need to do. And that seem like, I can't deal with that because I'm just doing well to live through the day. But I think what we can point out to them is that they're already doing planning in certain instances. Don't think of it like that. I suspect that most of our students realize, they look or listen, they know something about the weather. If it's going to rain, maybe they're going to bring an umbrella. Or maybe they're going to the football game on Friday night, and so they check and see and they take a jacket because it's going to be cold. I mean, that's planning. And so if they can see that they're already engaging this, and it seems really basic, but I think for students who often live in the tyranny of the moment, that it seems alien to them, and if you can point out to them that they doing this in other parts of their life. All they have to do then is begin to look at how they can transfer that into school. So obviously, if you're going to U of L game on the weekend, then you are going to perhaps figure out if you're going to tailgate, what are you going to cook, what you need to wear. So there's obviously planning going on. And how can you then incorporate that into your school process? One of the things about football, this actually came from a conversation with Patty Beebe at the end of the session at Southwest yesterday, and we were talking about football games, because I'll come back to that, sorry. We're talking about future story, where we're looking then in the longer term goals down the road. What do you want to be? What do you want to do? Why are you at college? And the idea of the versus methodical school, because you are looking for the path that is going to take you to this dream. Now, maybe you can buy a lottery ticket, you'll luck out and you'll win your millions, but most of the time it's going to take a plan with some work involved. And one of the things that probably most of our students can relate to is the Super Bowl. That if you want, as a Super Bowl team, if you as a football team, you want to go to the Super Bowl, you don't wake up, they were teasing me yesterday, I'm not much of a football fan. Super Bowl, that's on a Sunday, right? And I thought it was in January, but apparently it's in February. Okay, see, I used to be in the know. So anyway, the deal is, your coach doesn't wake up, the team doesn't wake up on Friday before the Super Bowl and said, I think we'd like to go to the Super Bowl. What it involves is a lot of planning ahead of time, a lot of preparation. And the students get that if you want to be in the Super Bowl, then as a team, there's preparation you have to do to reach that goal. You have to talk about plays, you take videos, you see how you do, you evaluate, and then you adjust your behavior based on what you see. And so think about in school, what kind of things do I need to do starting way in advance that are going to end up with me reaching my goal, which instead of the Super Bowl may be to transfer to a university or become a nurse, or maybe just complete that computer class that I need so I can be successful at work. So suddenly, where before they didn't see that there actually, number one, that there is work behind the scenes. How many times do we see students in advising who say, well, I work full-time, and I need to take a full-time load, and I have 5 children, but, I'm only in school for, like 12 hours a week, so I can do this. And they don't understand the preparation. And that's where I was thinking the football analogy, whether it's football or some other sport, actually works really well when you're trying to explain to students, if you have a big game on Friday, you don't have to be at the Pro Bowl, the pro football level. You don't just walk on the field or the court on Friday for the game without having done preparation. So even if you look at it in the context of why do you need to read and prepare for class? Well, think of it as if you're playing a sport. There are things you do before you get to the game. If the game is your class, there are things you have to do before you go to the game to get ready for that game. And in school, the game may be going to class. The preparation then is doing the readings or whatever. I think that there are so many ways you can use mental models to illustrate to students, and it doesn't have to be a picture. They might not get the visual stuff, but they will get, some of them will get, okay, yeah, I used to play basketball or whatever. They'll understand the preparation behind being a team that's going to be a winner at the big game. Making the link between adjusting your play to do things better. Well, what did you do on this test? It didn't go so well, so now you need to adjust that so that next time you'll perform better. So I think that really powerful opportunities here for students.
Can I add one comment?
Absolutely.
I think the thing to emphasize too is that it can happen by chance. People win the lottery, but they're rare. And you can use anything. The Olympics come around every 2 years. You know, they now separate the Winter and Summer Olympics. You can use all these reality shows, these voice talent shows, you know. Who do you think is going to win? How much practice do you think they put into it? Now, it might be somebody that didn't practice. They just got lucky. They sang their best on that particular night. They didn't have any allergies going on that night. They got lucky. They won the lottery. But those are rare. Do you really want to risk your life to those kind of odds? Or do you want to have a backup plan? And when we can explain it in terms that they can understand, to maybe even situations where these students have respect for some of these athletes, celebrities, whatever, you know, it can help them begin to understand the need to, the value of planning, something they're already doing in some aspects of their lives.
Why do I have to take this stupid class? It doesn't pertain to my major. You know, well, maybe there are things that you had to do when you were training to be an athlete that weren't directly related to your sport, but they still helped prepare you, or they were still required, or whatever. And so suddenly, you know, they might not like it anymore, but, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. Okay. So if we look at a couple of other things that we've talked about in the past, you've had some introduction to the under-resourced student material, and Rhonda touched again on language registers. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is the fact that there are all these language registers, and students have experience with some. Maybe they don't have the formal register, and you know, we've tried to impress upon them or us that it's not that the casual register is bad, but it's knowing when to use it. And so what I'd like to do at this point is ask, does anybody have an idea, we've got some that we'll be able to for a mental model that would illustrate language registers? Exactly. I mean, it doesn't, and it doesn't, I think what I used to do is try to make this really hard. So it's behavior that's appropriate in one place and not another. So it could be, actually focusing on language, what you yell at a sports event versus class.
When I taught developmental English, I did a translation paper. I had to do rap music versus Tom Brokaw news music, news words. And they'd actually translate a rap song into standard American formal English.
That's cool. I did an exercise this semester with my FYE students where they translated the mission into casual register. That was kind of fun. Sometimes, you know, the doesn't actually have to be. So one of the things we thought of that really isn't language is wardrobe.
I was going to say laying around in your comfy PJs on your couch versus getting dressed up to go out to
Right.
work or to a wedding or church or whatever.
Exactly. They're both good. I mean, they're not, one is not better than the other, but you just have to know when it's appropriate. And so you don't show up at a formal wedding or, you know, your church service, most likely in your PJs and your fuzzy slippers.
You know, I have a conversation all the time about cell phones in the classroom. I say, think of it like church. It's sacred space. Don't get your cell phone out of here.
Yeah, then that's a mental model. I mean, again, that's just something they can relate to. So we also talked about celebrations, the kind of celebration you might have for your daughter's, your daughter just had a birthday recently, for your daughter's birthday is probably very different than a celebration that you would have for an anniversary with, you know, your partner. So both are good. They're just different. And so they begin to understand then, all right, I got it. It's not that you're telling me that what I am doing, or, you know, it's not a value judgment. It's understanding what is appropriate.
And this really helps the student understand that by adopting formal register, something they may not be familiar with, they might not do in their world, okay, their family setting, their social setting, they may not do that. It helps them understand they don't have to take on the value system of the middle class institution. They see the utility of college then, okay? Because that's often something that you hear from under-resourced students. Oh, I'm not going to become like them. But they see the utility and the flexibility that it offers you then in life to be versed in both. It opens up options to you. Okay? It's not, and it really communicates. This isn't about placing value, more value on one than the other. You know, I can't go home and talk to my teenage daughter in formal register all the time. I've tried that, and she looks at me and says, you know, you're not at work anymore. So, you know, we need both. Okay, and I think that using these kinds of mental models is a good way to help students understand, you know, we're not trying to convert you to something you don't want to be.
So let's think about hidden rules, because we've also talked before about the hidden rules of college. You know, hidden rules are things that drive your behavior. They are explicit. So, you know, a lot of times, you know, students come to college, we just expect them to know what's appropriate and what's not, how to act, what to do. And so the hidden rules are just that, things that we shouldn't have to explain to people, because of course they understand how things need to go, what they need to do. And we know now that that's not true. So can you think of some examples that would serve as mental models for the idea of hidden rules? Could be a story, could be a visual.
Your iceberg example works for that.
So talk a little more about that.
What's under the surface that's gonna shoot you down if you're
Exactly. Exactly.
not prepared for it.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? I had an experience, I had probably just finished graduate school, and my brother actually was living in New York City. And we're from Kentucky, from Louisville, but from Kentucky. And my brother is much more of an urban animal than I am. So it was the first time I'd gone and stayed with him. He had to go to work. So and I'm his big sister, but I can vividly remember this, this conversation before he left. All right, Sherry, these are the rules, because you don't know the hidden rules of New York City. Don't make eye contact, don't smile at anybody, don't talk to anybody, focus straight ahead, mind your own business, and look like you belong. Because exactly, you know, be looking around, and because I didn't know the hidden rules of surviving New York City in that way. And so I think a lot of students maybe who, they may relate more to something like that. I've also in the past told the story about going to France, being in the train station and seeing this chaos. You know, I'm very much a rule follower, and so when you move ahead in order, and it was insanity. There was this mass of people, these little ladies, little old ladies, with their elbows out, and the way you got to the counter in the front is you used your elbows. And there was a lot of standing in the train station. But I didn't understand the hidden rules, because that's not where I come from. That's not how I. And so then students begin to understand, oh, okay, And it's not that one is necessarily better than the other, it's different. And we can't expect them to necessarily understand our Jefferson and higher if they're a generation college student. Family who have been to college and had that experience.
We are just about out of time, but I want to show you a brief clip. Okay. I give Betty Weldon credit on this. Not all our students might know who Beverly Hillbillies are, but many of them might. And they still might really understand it. She uses this now. The Clampetts get culture.
And rocking those together.
Well, tell me, Granny, what is this problem that's got you to rocking so?
It's us, kid. We don't belong out here. These lots don't want our kind around.
Well, whatever put that notion in your head?
Well, you're just put near Christmas. Back home, folks should be stopping by, passing the time of day, fetching presents, and hefting their friendly jug with us.
Well, you gotta remember one thing, Granny. Back home, we knowed everybody, and everybody knowed us. Out here, we ain't much acquainted yet.
You can't get acquainted with these folks out here. I've been crying all morning. I put on my friendly hat, bring out my rock, and a jug of hard cider. And I've been sitting here waving and hollering at folks and pointing to my jug.
Nobody stopped?
Only a policeman. That's where my jug went. To the police station.
I bet you got a bunch of friends down there by now.
Let's face it, kid. We ain't got as many friends out here as a horse has toes.
It's a good way to see the idea. One's not better than the other. Okay, different ways of interacting with there. We have a little quiz left. We're almost done here. So here's your quiz. Y'all remember? Yeah. Which is it?
Very good.
Would you ever, if I didn't give you, who knows, I said,
Yes, you, okay. So when you were talking about, I tell stories all the time. And so I never really thought about them as mental models until today when you were talking about this. But I just had this experience a few minutes ago before I came here, so I thought it would be worth sharing. So a few weeks ago, we were on, in FYE 105, our topic was critical thinking. And at one point I was trying to talk to them about the importance of knowing why you think what you think. And they're like, what do you mean by that? I don't get it. I mean, they just are really having a hard time wrapping their mind around me trying to drill down to why, it's not just what do you think about it, but why do you think what you think? And why is it so important to really know why you think what you think? So I hadn't really prepared this or thought about it. It just sort of came to me, and I was like, here's an example. So I said, there was this woman who was baking a ham, and she, as she always did, she sliced both